misclassification from the federal perspective. First of all, I also want to acknowledge that I'm very lucky to have my legislative director who works for Congressman McDermott back from DC. He's here. And Toby will, at the end of my remarks, come up and give an update since even yesterday about where things are legislatively regarding Congressman McDermott's bill and this issue. So first of all, I just want to welcome and give greetings on behalf of Congressman Jim McDermott, who proudly represents the 7th Congressional District of Washington. As your representative, he serves as the 3rd senior ranking member on the Ways and Means Committee and as the ranking chair of the Subcommittee on Trade, as well as a member of Oversight Subcommittee. And during the last Congress, he served as the chair of the Subcommittee on Income Security and Family Support, which oversaw our country's safety net programs, including unemployment insurance, TANF, and foster care. The Big Rig survey and research report is critical. Part of the difficulty of addressing this problem has been the lack of current and accurate data regarding misclassification. For instance, the IRS made its last comprehensive misclassification estimate in 1984. That survey found 15% of employers misclassified 3.4 million workers as independent contractors, causing an estimated total tax loss of $1.6 billion in Social Security tax, unemployment tax, and income tax. So, and the last time they even tried to estimate that was in inflation-adjusted 2006 dollars, which would have meant a tax loss of $2.72 billion. However, as anyone who has worked with low-wage workers and immigrant workers knows, misclassification is a widespread problem across many industries. And as Congressman McDermott has championed in this past session the modernization of unemployment insurance, he became even more aware of this problem as he heard the stories of deserving workers who had been excluded from receiving benefits because of misclassification. So how did this happen? Well, back in 1978, and this is, again, obviously there's a longer history, but we're going to go with the specific problem here. Of 1978, Congress included a safe harbor provisions of the tax code known as Section 530 in the Revenue Act of 1978 as a temporary measure to protect employers from the perceived threat of retroactive assessments due to new rules the IRS was preparing on the issue of misclassification of workers at the time. It was supposed to be temporary, but instead, in 1982, it was made permanent. And since that time, the pool of misclassified workers has grown steadily. The broad effect of the safe harbor and the gagging of the IRS has resulted in an uneven playing field for businesses who properly classify their workers versus those who do not, as well as denying workers access to their basic rights and protections on the job. And so because of that, on July 30th, 2009, Congressman McDermott introduced H.R. 3408, the Taxpayer Responsibility, Accountability, and Consistency Act of 2009. And in addition, there was a similar version introduced in the Senate at that time. So I'm going to close my initial remarks by quoting Congressman McDermott that when he spoke on the floor when he introduced this legislation. So basically, the aim of this legislation is to reverse the growing trend of misclassification of employees as independent contractors. Independent contractors serve a legitimate purpose in our workforce, our economy, and in many business models. These contractors are important to our economy and often provide the flexibility that many businesses need. Some employers, however, are using a loophole that exists in the Internal Revenue Code to treat workers that are actually employees as contractors in order to reduce their own tax liability and avoid federal and state labor law. When employees are misclassified as contractors, responsible companies lose business, workers lose rights and protections, and the federal and state governments lose out of dollars and much needed revenue. So with that, I would like Toby to come up. He has no voice. He lost it somewhere in talking today. But if you can hear him and understand him.
This or that kind of worker. should be an independent contractor is something that the IRS, for the most part, can't question. I mean, for the most part, meaning the 99% case. So businesses around the country have taken this safe harbor and have put more and more and more workers into it. One of the problems with dealing with this on a national level is that there is no known aggregate number of how many independent contractors are being misclassified. Independent contractors aren't bad things, bad people. Sometimes they serve a very good use. They want to be independent contractors. They have a proper function. It's a fine part of the economy. There are lots and lots of people who are misclassified as independent contractors, particularly in the building trades, particularly in typical union jobs, bricklayers, electrical workers, the drywallers, all these forms. And there are also other industries that use independent contracting as a way of doing business. A very typical one is independent insurance agents, independent stockbrokers, messenger and courier services. These are all big independent contractor industries. So in a 100 million person workforce, at a minimum, probably 3 million, at a maximum, 6, 7, 8 million people are misclassified. And there is a tax cap problem, which a lot of people talk about. And then there's also the human rights issue. As a political problem, this is a very big one. Corporations, a lot of corporations have said that solving this problem is not one that they want at all. And irrespective of the politics of the audience, the general concept is that Democrats want this fixed and Republicans don't. And there's a lot of money, and an enormous amount of money and lobbying and so on that goes behind keeping this from being fixed. 33 years of it. So the thing that made this even more urgent than the last year, even though people wanted to fix this for a long time, is the health care bill. And there are a lot of employers who are going to start shifting people from full-time employee to independent contractor to drive their full-time employee count down so that they don't have to provide health care benefits. So they end up in the exchanges. So this is something that Congress is very worried about. The reason for the 530 problem in the first place, why the law was created, why was this loophole, people call it a loophole, it's actually just the law. It's bad law, but it's law. Law says you can do this, so they do it. It's not an unintended law. It may or may not be an unintended consequence if it's abused. The fixing of this makes many corporations concerned that if I'm a corporation and I've misclassified you for the last 15 years of your life, and maybe in year 7, when I started misclassifying you, you had a slip and fall accident where I violated OSHA rules. Misclassification gets fixed. You can no longer misclassify workers. How you classify workers is clear. Can you come and sue me for all of the back wages you were denied, for the liability for the injury you suffered when I broke OSHA rules, but they weren't available to you? What is my retroactive penalty? This is what scares the heck out of corporate America. And as a justice issue, it would be hard to argue that this shouldn't be addressed. As a practical issue, it's a nightmare. There are people who were denied pensions. There are people who are denied a proper amount of work hours per week, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of damage or injustice that's been done to an awful lot of people, millions of people, people who are no longer in the workforce, people who are currently in the workforce. What's their redress? The only way you can solve this in any practical way, if you look at the politics of the country and the makeup of Congress, even in a Congress that had 59 Democrats in the Senate and a huge majority of Democrats in the House, was going to have a very hard time passing a bill that did a basic fix. Having a House that's Republican and getting a decent So there's some good news, though. The good news is that states aren't waiting. There's a big tax problem. States looking at bankruptcy, states having huge tax problems. They want this fixed. They want the businesses who are competing fairly and classifying workers properly to be on an even playing field. They want the problems with their contracting. If I'm a government entity and I put out a contract and a company does a bid that has independent contractors in it, and the one that doesn't will be a higher, more expensive bid, and the law often requires me to take the lowest bidder. So this is a problem that states want to fix. So somewhere between 23 and 33 states are acting on the state level to fix this, which is pretty good. The problem is that they're only doing it for state taxes, not federal. And it's a patchwork of how they solve it. So the bill that Mr. McDermott and Senator Kerry have co-introduced steps around all the retroactive stuff because it's so complicated and sinks the bill from ever passing. Allows the IRS to make rules, and that's it. The IRS takes, actually it doesn't, there's no time limit. The IRS can issue rules for how to use the 20-point test. The 20-point test effectively talks about control. If you have no control of your work life, you're a full-time employee. If you have total control of your work life, you're an independent contractor. When you come, whether you wear a uniform, what hours you perform, whether there's a code of conduct, all that stuff. The big case is usually FedEx, right? Yes. They wear a uniform, they drive a truck, they're told how to pick up packages, how to speak to people, what to do, all that stuff, and then yet they're classified as independent contractors. It's kind of a joke. But that's the big federal case on this. But the idea is to allow the IRS to make rules in the next 18 months or 2 years after the bill's passed, and then for people, for companies to reclassify workers within a reasonable amount of time, usually about a year. It's complicated. A lot of the companies that misclassify workers don't have HR departments, don't have lawyers, don't know how to do this. They're just really bare bones shops. They may be high profit margin, but they don't have a lot of infrastructure in their companies. And they reclassify their workers, and slowly but surely, the number of workers who were misclassified gets emptied out. There's still some, and then the IRS also can go and start applying those rules if you misclassify, starting from the date of the implementation of the law. So that's what the bill does. Excuse me, the way that you get this passed now is by House, well, Mr. McDermott and Senator Kerry agreeing on a new version of the law, the Senate passing it in a tax bill, and on something that the House Republicans must or can't amend. It can't change, and that must pass. So oddly enough, something like defense appropriations. We insist on funding our wars. That has to pass. And if Democrats want to get something done, usually that's what they pay attention to. So anyways, that's the state of this. The possibility of getting this done in the next 2 years is, I don't know, but 20%, 25 maybe. The administration has put it in its federal budget. So it's a line item of things that the administration would like done. So anyways, I can answer questions if you want me to.